Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Jenny Sloan. I'm president of the Constitution Project. And on behalf of the Constitution Project, the Washington Times, and the Robert H. Smith Center for the Constitution at James Madison's Montpelier, welcome to our annual observance of Constitution Day. It is terrific to see so many people here, and I'm also delighted to welcome all of you in schools around the country who are joining us virtually via our live webcast. Before I begin, I want to remind you to please silence your phones. Each year on Constitution Day, the Constitution Project presents our Constitutional Commentary Award to a person or persons whose work has improved the quality of public discourse through insightful and articulate analysis of pressing constitutional issues. So I'm thrilled this year to welcome one of the recipients of our Constitutional Commentary Award, Piper Kerman, executive consultant on Netflix Emmy-nominated original series, Orange is the New Black. Piper is, of course, also the author of the best-selling memoir on which this series is based. Following the award presentation, a panel of experts, including Piper, will discuss the status of women in prison and the unique challenges that they face. One of America's great constitutionalists, the late Senator Robert Byrd, had the idea to create an annual Constitution Day to educate young Americans about our founding charter and about its relevance in our daily lives. These days, unfortunately, it appears that many older Americans could also use the same education. As you may recall from your history classes, in the spring of 1987, delegates from each state gathered at a constitutional convention in Philadelphia. They came from all over the country and from many walks of life, pledging to set aside their personal biases to develop consensus on how best to govern our country, a lesson that seems to be lost on today's lawmakers. They worked through a sweltering summer to produce the document on which our federal government is now based, and formally adopted it and sent it to the states for ratification on September 17, 1987. That date, September 17th, is the date Senator Byrd selected to observe Constitution Day. In proposing this commemoration, Senator Byrd said, "One will not protect what one does not value, and one will not value what one does not understand." Helping Americans of all ages understand what is at stake when our Constitution is at risk is the core mission of the Constitution Project. Created out of the belief that we must cast aside the labels that divide us in order to keep our democracy strong, our organization brings together policy experts, government officials, and legal practitioners from across the political spectrum to foster consensus-based solutions to today's toughest constitutional challenges. As TCP moves toward our 20th anniversary in 2017, we've identified three key focus areas. First, safeguarding the personal information, privacy, and First Amendment rights affected by rapid technological innovations. Second, making government more open and accountable, and otherwise promoting respect for the checks and balances and separation of powers established by our founding charter. And third, ensuring that our government maintains public safety responsibly. In other words, by exercising its law enforcement, national security, and immigration powers in a way that respects the Constitution's letter and spirit. Our conversation today focuses on this vital third objective. Before I get to the award itself, I'd like to thank our host, Aaron Fox, which has once again provided us with this technologically savvy space that allows us not only to have all of you join us here, but also to webcast our event across the country. I'd also like to thank our co-sponsors, the Washington Times, where our board member David Keene is opinion editor, and our friends at the Robert H. Smith Center for the Constitution at James Madison's Montpelier, who've generously provided our lunch reception. I'm delighted that this wonderful organization and supporter of our work has sent their Vice President, Doug Smith, to say a few words today. Doug?
Thank you, Jenny. As always, in the national conversation about the U.S. Constitution, we need organizations like the Constitution Project to be one of those vital voices that are driving the debate. It's really quite important. And As the home of James Madison and where the Center for the Constitution is located, I can think of no better way on Constitution Day to bring one of those voices to the table. Madison once said, when he was called the father of the Constitution, that it took many heads and many hands to create what we have. And you are indeed many of the hands and hearts and heads that continue to make it relevant, to keep it alive, and keep the conversation going. So thank you for all that you do.
Thank you so much, Doug, for your kind words and for all that you do. In 1998, Piper Kerman was just like many of her neighbors in the West Village of New York, a graduate of Smith College. I've lost my page. Where did it go? It has disappeared. Hang on. Romantically involved with a wonderful man, the daughter of a successful Boston family, and seemingly well on the way to success herself. As she put it, just a nice blonde lady. What happened next was anything but ordinary. She was convicted of money laundering and drug trafficking, the result of her involvement several years earlier in an international drug trafficking ring. Though she never engaged in smuggling the drugs themselves, Piper did help move the cash. And so, in February 2004, she found herself at the gates of the Federal Correctional Institution in Danbury, Connecticut, to start serving a 13-month sentence for criminal conspiracy. Her time in Danbury became the basis for her best-selling 2010 memoir, Orange is the New Black, and for the Netflix series of the same name. I know many of you are as addicted to this series as I am. At times humorous, at times poignant, always informative, the show looks at a world far removed from Smith College and the West Village. Here's a clip that we call Piper Goes to Prison. As most of you know, this series examines the complicated interactions between race, gender, poverty, sexuality, discrimination, and disparity of power within the criminal justice system. As show creator Jenji Cohen put it, Piper was my Trojan horse. You're not going to go into a network and sell a show on really fascinating tales of Black women and Latina women and old women and criminals, Cohen told NPR's Terry Gross. But she went on, if you take this white girl, this sort of fish out of water, and you follow her in, you can then expand your world and tell all of those other stories. And boy, does it tell stories. Stories of racism and prejudice, of harassment and sexual coercion. Stories of substandard medical care and shackling during childbirth. Stories of mental illness, ignored and harsh and unwarranted solitary confinement. Stories of government power run amok and the inability of individuals to fight back. Most importantly, Orange is the New Black, in both humorous and heartbreaking ways, exposes a wide audience to the acute problems facing our criminal justice system, and it does so in ways that make people care about both the problems and the people affected by it. When the show debuted in July 2013, TV Guide called it a terrifically entertaining piece of original program that's truly embracingly original. The Washington Post said it was the best TV show about prison ever made. This past July, Orange is the New Black received 12 Primetime Emmy Award nominations. It also won 3 Critics' Choice Television Awards and a People's Choice Award, and it has been renewed for a 3rd season, which I'm impatiently waiting for. Unfortunately, it speaks volumes about our society that it takes a TV series about a white woman to open the public's eyes to these long documented problems that affect a disproportionate number of people of color. But we're grateful that it does. And so today we humbly add the Constitution Project's Constitutional Commentary Award to the list of honors Orange is the New Black has received. I'm delighted that Piper Kerman herself is here to accept the award. Piper. Well, congratulations.
Thank you very much.
Jenny, where is the award?
Oh, we can get that later.
Where is it? in front of me.
Oh, I think it's this.
Oh, this in the box. If it's in a box, I don't recognize it.
Ah,
There you go.
thank you very much.
Thank you, Piper.
Thank you.
Thank you for everything you've done.
All right. I'm a little afraid I might break it. Oh, wait, bring my folder back.
Oh, and also take the box.
All right. Wonderful. Thank you, Ginny. Thank you, thank you. And thank you to the Constitution Project for this incredible honor. It is very humbling to think about the great value of the work of previous recipients, and I am very, very grateful to be included among them and to have the show included among them. I have seen that clip that just played many, many, many times, and yet I am still a little bit amazed every time I watch it. For one thing, unlike some other parts of the show, the scene is almost word for word from my memoir. And for another, they just did a great job. Every detail you see there, down to, the bras and socks on the plastic hangers, those are just like the cell in which I spent my first night in prison. And perhaps most important, the themes that I think are primary in the book, themes of race and class and gender and power and prison rules and prisoner rules, like don't make your bed, and most importantly, friendship and empathy. These themes are all there, present in just 3 minutes of TV, and that is sort of an amazing thing when you think about all the time it takes to write a book. I'm sure that everyone here today knows that the United States has the biggest prison population in the world by far, 5% of the world's population, and yet 25% of the world's prisoners. In fact, we are the most incarcerated society in human history. No nation has ever locked up so many of its citizens. And yet, these millions of Americans disappear from their communities and, in many ways, from public consciousness when they disappear behind the walls of a prison or a jail, losing most of their rights of citizenship. And that's why I think that it is so important for human faces and stories to explain to us the impact of mass incarceration as a public policy. I don't think that I recognized when I decided to write this book that I was offering constitutional commentary. When I set out to tell my own experience as a criminal defendant and then as a federal prisoner, my desires were very simple. I hoped that by sharing my story, I might get people to pick up a book about prison who would not typically choose a book about prison. And I hoped that readers would come away from the book with different ideas about who is in prison in this country and why they're there and what really happens to people behind prison walls. Different ideas, and I hoped that they would ask a lot more questions of those who run our criminal justice systems after reading the book or after watching these stories. The truth is that you cannot write or talk about the criminal justice system without offering constitutional commentary. Whether you're talking about safe and equitable policing, or the right to counsel, or fair sentencing, or regaining the basic rights of citizenship after a criminal conviction, you will be grappling with constitutional questions and the fundamental rights that are supposed to be shared by all Americans. And that's why the work of the Constitution Project is so important. The Constitution Project provides intellectual rigor combined with common wisdom found in our Constitution, and they do this by bringing together policy experts and brilliant legal minds from across the political spectrum, and that's really important, to find solutions to our most difficult constitutional challenges. I first became intimately familiar with the Constitution Project through their important focus on public defense reform. The right to counsel when accused of a crime is a fundamental of our criminal justice system, so much so that pretty much anyone who has watched a cop show can probably recite, you have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be appointed to you, right? And yet, too many Americans are deprived of their Sixth Amendment rights in our courtrooms every single day. I remember very vividly my first months after being indicted, when things like plea agreements were being negotiated. Truthfully, I struggled to comprehend mandatory minimums and how sentencing guidelines work and just the simple facts of how my case was proceeding. And I am very fortunate to have a great education. I mean, I'm a college graduate and so on. I was represented by excellent, and I have to say very expensive, private counsel. And we know for a fact that the representation a person has in court makes an enormous difference in the outcome of their case. That is so obvious that it seems almost ridiculous to point out on many levels. 80% of people who are accused of a crime are too poor to hire an attorney. And I would compare our indigent defense system in this country to a threadbare and frankly very ugly patchwork quilt. In many states, the quality of a poor person's defense will be determined by the zip code in which they are charged. I feel that this is such an enormous disconnect between most Americans' ability to recite the Miranda rights and the sort of near universal recognition of that constitutional right, compared with the failure of federal, state, and county governments to make good on the Sixth Amendment in our court system. So whenever I speak to college students or to library audiences, to other folks out in the community, I flag this sort of under-the-radar issue as deserving attention and action. And I am grateful to the Constitution Project for their unrelenting commitment to this facet of justice reform, one among many of the areas of the criminal justice system on which they advocate so persuasively. Too often these days, we see a willingness to trade our citizens' constitutional rights for perceived security or hoped for safety from threats. And this is true whether we're talking about debates that arise from changes in technology or the events that we see unfold in the streets of Ferguson, Missouri, and other American communities. But infringing on the rights of others does not make us safer. It leads us down a road of moral decay from which there's no return. And that's why it's so important to me to support the work of organizations like the Constitution Project, because they are fighting for those rights that all Americans share. So in just a moment, we are going to have a great discussion of women and prison and women in the criminal justice system with a deeply impressive group of women that the Constitution Project has brought together today. And I am very grateful that they've all agreed to give their time this afternoon. Before that, I think we're going to see one more clip from the show. And this is one that departs from my personal story, I'm happy to say, as it depicts solitary confinement, which is a punishment that I thankfully did not experience. The isolation of solitary confinement is the harshest punishment we inflict in this country other than the penalty of death. I would say that solitary confinement is overused in our nation's prisons and jails, and often capriciously, despite its terrible impact on the people who are put in isolation. And a healthy person put into total isolation after about 10 days begins to significantly deteriorate physically, mentally, and emotionally. I would also point out, though, that a prison sentence is its own form of isolation. It's isolation from a person's family and community with debatable recompense for the harm that the person has done to the community, and often lasting marginalization for many people after their sentence is served. So we must struggle together through challenging constitutional questions as we work to reduce our prison population, which is something that I think all Americans should be able to agree on as a goal. And I hope that we can find ways to hold most people accountable to their communities in ways that do not rely on the isolation of a prison cell. And so I thank the Constitution Project for this amazing award and recognition for the book and the show and the story. And with that, I think we can watch the clip. Dance.
Good afternoon. My name is Sarah Turberville, and I'm Senior Counsel at the Constitution Project, and I would like to invite all of our distinguished panelists to come down and have a seat. While they do that, I'd just like to say that I think that brief snapshot that we just watched illustrates how Orange is the New Black shows in sometimes the most absolute wrenching ways the distinctive ways in which incarceration can strip the people who reside within prison of their humanity and their liberty, the most critical rights that our Constitution is meant to safeguard. So we're thankful to this talented and distinguished group of panelists who are willing to share their thoughts and experiences on women who are incarcerated and the unique constitutional issues presented by the sentencing and imprisonment of women. I know that our panelists are uninterested in a lengthy introduction, but please allow me to briefly tell you a little bit about them, perhaps with a few tidbits that are not found in your program. Along with our award recipient, Piper Kerman, we are also joined by the Honorable Vanessa Ruiz. Judge Ruiz is the first and only Hispanic American appointed to the D.C. Court of Appeals. She is also she's also a leader in the National Association of Women Judges and served as its president in 2006. She has received many national and local awards for her commitment to equal justice and has been a stalwart supporter of improving female prison conditions and successful outcomes for women who are released from incarceration. To her left is Professor Brenda Smith of American University's Washington College of Law. Professor Smith is a prolific scholar, litigator, and teacher on many of the issues facing incarcerated women. She created the National Women's Prison Project and was also appointed by Congress as a commissioner to the Prison Rape Elimination Act Commission. She has made the intersection of issues of gender, race, and crime her life's work, tirelessly seeking to bring the plight of those who are the most marginalized in our society into the public's consciousness. And also joining us is Kathleen, or Kathy Dennehy. Ms. Dennehy possesses unparalleled experience in the management of prisons, having served as the chief of both male and female corrections institutions, including as superintendent of the oldest and longest continually running women's prison in the United States. In 2003, she assumed the role of acting commissioner of correction in Massachusetts after a high-profile inmate homicide, and was formally appointed commissioner in 2004, the first woman to be appointed to that position. And finally, our discussion will be facilitated by Ruth Marcus, who has served as a reporter, an editorial writer, an editor, and a columnist at the Washington Post since she's joined the Post in 1984. Soon after she became a regular columnist at the Post, she was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize for Commentary in 2007. She's covered domestic politics, including many of the critical issues we want to explore today, and we are delighted that she has agreed to moderate what is sure to be a far-reaching and captivating discussion. And so with that, I will turn it over to Ruth. Thank you all for being here.
Thanks. So, can you guys hear me?
Turn it on.
Okay, technology. We've mastered it. Well, thank you all for coming. I'm thrilled to be moderating this panel, and happy Constitution Day to everybody. In our conversation leading up to today, we decided to divide the many issues that are touched on so brilliantly in Orange is the New Black into three different kind of large buckets. One is issues of disparate impact, both the disparate impact within the women's prison population in terms of the overrepresentation on race, and also the fact of women being such a small slice of the prison population and the impact of resources for them. Second, issues of health, including mental health and including issues of solitary confinement, which were brought up so scarily and powerfully in the clip. And by the way, if you're looking for more information about this, if you Google Piper Kerman's testimony before the Senate Judiciary Committee on solitary confinement, it is really one of the most chilling documents I've ever read. And third, issues of women's autonomy in prison, issues relating to pregnancy and motherhood, issues involving sterilization, and this is only last, it's certainly not least, issues relating to sexual abuse and sexual assault. And it being Constitution Day and this being the Constitution Project, what we're going to try to do with a lot of help from Professor Smith is to try to layer into each of those a little bit of the constitutional nexus, the degree to which the Constitution either offers some help and guidance and protection in this area, or the degree to which it doesn't, or at least courts have decided that it doesn't. So with that and then we're going to make sure to leave really enough time to get the questions from you guys, which I know are going to be more interesting and more varied than my questions. But I wanted to start by setting the stage with Kathy, I think, who had the fascinating experience of arriving to run a women's correctional facility after having experienced a male correctional facility. And just set the stage for us, if you would. How is that different?
It's very different. Is my mic on?
No, you need to push it.
Oh, there we go. It's very different, Ruth. I had started in prison in Massachusetts in the 1970s. And for those of you that aren't old enough to remember, that was a really difficult time in this country. Research was just starting to focus in on men. That coincided with my career. I spent my first 17 years working on the male side of corrections and then became the superintendent at MCI Framingham. And, I often tell folks my time at Framingham really was an epiphany for me, both personally and professionally. I think I, like many of my colleagues, had fallen into the trap of thinking that it's a one-size-fits-all system. The system is really skewed in terms of its policies and procedures towards addressing men. And what I found at Framingham at every point in turn was just such a disconnect. And I remember my very, very first day in a male facility. I always worked long hours, but I could go in, do my job, and work a couple of extra hours and go home. At the women's prison, I found myself working 10, 12, 16, 18-hour days, often there until midnight. And it dawned on me, so much of it was because of my interaction with the women who lived there. And I asked a colleague friend of mine who was a mental health clinician to help me understand what I was seeing. And he introduced me to the theory of relational needs and the differences in gender. And, quite frankly, most prison systems for the 70s, 80s, and 90s paid no attention to the unique needs of women, especially needs that have a relationship to recidivism, like addiction. It was very, very short-sighted. It's only recently, within the last 20 years, that attention has been paid to women, the special slice of the criminal justice population. Women make up anywhere between 5 to 7% of the offender population. And I know later when I went on to become commissioner, it became clear to me that there was a resource allocation issue. And I'm sure we're going to talk about that a great deal as it impacts all the areas that Piper's clip highlighted. But there is an enormous difference. And when I think about how that relates to the Constitution, I probably couldn't pass a pop-up quiz. But who was it who said to her husband when he went off to draft the Constitution, "Remember the ladies"?
Abigail Adams.
Abigail Adams. And I remember thinking at Framingham, no one has remembered the ladies. The ladies do not have a voice in the system. And to Piper's enormous credit, your work helps to give them that voice.
Well, this is a great segue because Brenda, tell us about these ladies.
Oh my goodness.
Who are they? What is different about them from the male prison population or from the general population? How much of a lob is that to you? There you go.
Okay. So first, what I want to say just in terms of, I want to thank you again for the opportunity. And I think Kathy's done a really great job of setting it up because, you know, one of the things that I hope that we talk about a little bit is pathways, about what brings women into the system. And there are very different things that bring women into the system. So I think that's one of the things that's different, right? You know, as they say often, behind every good man is a woman. Every good man is a woman. And unfortunately for the criminal justice system, those women get pushed to the front. And so often women end up in custody because of their involvement with men, particularly in drug conspiracies, robberies, and other serious offenses. And also because of the way that the system is set up in terms of sentencing around cooperation. If they have little to offer in terms of cooperation, they don't have much to offer in terms of bargaining around sentences. I want to talk a little bit, though, as well about the great chart that the Constitution Project provided. And what you'll see that the rates of incarcerated women are decreasing, right? But if you look, you will see that the numbers are increasing. And in fact, there was actually a report that just came out from the Bureau of Justice Statistics a day or so ago, which talked about the fact that the increase for this year was largely because of the increase of women in custody. You may not be able to see it very well here, but one of the other things that you'll see that African American women are 2 times more likely than white women to be imprisoned. You'll also see a little orange bar right there as well, which indicates that starting in 2012 and 2013, that was the first year that the Bureau of Justice Statistics started disaggregating numbers for Native American women, Asian, Pacific Islander. And so that's one of the things that we're also just starting to get a handle on. I had a quick opportunity to cram a little bit and to look at sort of what women were incarcerated for. And one of the things that was very interesting to me was the high numbers of women who were involved in violent offenses, right? And so that number is up around 47%, I believe, but also drug offenses account for a large percentage of them as well. I'm willing to bet that often that involvement really is because there's a co-defendant. And certainly I know that there are judges in the audience who can talk to that a lot more than I can. Another thing that I think that is also important, and I'm sure that we'll talk about it, is that largely these women are mothers, right? So when you have a woman who's incarcerated, there's also children out there. And there are also other families who are affected, family members who are affected by that as well. There used to be a great statistic that talked about when men went into prison, about 89% of their children were cared for by the mothers of those children. Flip it for women. So about 20% of the fathers take care. And so we're talking about women who are moms, often who have addictions problems, and may also be in relationships of violence or oppression or coercion with the men in their lives, and often that leads them into custody.
Judge Ruiz, the women who are charged with crimes are sentenced. Appellate judges like yourself either overturn their convictions or sentences or uphold them, probably more of the latter than the former. Then they go off to prison, and this is a leading question. What happens next?
what happens next is, well, let's talk about the role of judges. As you say, the courts and judges, they're the ones who oversee the trials or accept pleas in the most cases, vast percentage of cases. These are pleas that are entered. And then they sentence, trial judges will sentence the convicted person. The person is then goes off to prison. Courts and judges do not control the operation of prisons. Nothing. Sometimes judges can make a recommendation or a suggestion as to where a person should be placed, or a treatment which should be provided to a prisoner. But these are not binding on the prison system. I think, Piper, that you mentioned in your book, there was one prisoner who actually got into drug treatment as a result of the recommendation made by a judge. Probation is different because when a person is put on probation, that is under court supervision. So the terms and conditions of probation, whether probation will be revoked, their judges do maintain a certain level of control. The other times that courts will become involved in the operation of a prison is, of course, when there is a lawsuit filed.
Exactly.
Many times alleging that there are constitutional or other violations of law in the prison and the way that the conditions of the prisoners. And if a finding is made that there have been constitutional or other legal violations, then judges many times those lawsuits will end in a consent agreement of some sort that is entered in the court, and many times a master will be appointed who will then report to the judge. So in that sense, in those limited circumstances, there might be continuing supervision by a court over the way a court system or a particular prison is run. It could be anything from overcrowding issues to the provision or the non-provision of necessary health services, undue violence in the prison. The state does have an obligation to keep prisoners safe. So there are those cases, but in the vast majority, from a systemic point of view, once a person is sentenced and goes off to prison, judges and courts are really out of the picture. That is not to say, however, that judges and courts should wash their hands and should not be interested. To the contrary, judges should be concerned and need to be. After all, the judge's sentence is what lands the person in prison. And although there is some discretion in that, as we all know, there are sentencing guidelines. You alerted to that. There are mandatory minimums. But judges, trial judges clearly are the ones who impose a sentence that's going to make a person end up in prison. Judges, many times, the sentencing judge, many times get letters from the prisoner complaining about conditions in the prison. So judges many times know what is going on in the prison. Plus, every day, judges see time and again the consequences of the breakdown in the prison system. They see the family breakup, because then they have to deal with, now what about these children? Do they have to be put in foster care? Is this person going to lose parental rights? Is this woman going to lose her parental rights because she has been sentenced for a long time and is then unable to keep contact with her kids, take care of them? Judges see the problems of untreated addictions. People go, they serve their prison time, they are released back into the community, but they're no better off than when they went in. They may well be worse off and go back into some of the same behaviors that landed them in the problem in the first place. The whole issue of unpreparedness for release from prison is one that judges do know about, and is another reason why courts and judges do need to become informed and involved in really looking at what is happening in the nation's prison at the federal and the state level and trying to improve the conditions.
If we rehearsed this, it couldn't have been more perfect, because the last kind of opening question that I wanted to ask was about the issues of unpreparedness for release from prison. Because Piper, there are a multiplicity of ways in which prison systems fail prisoners in general and women prisoners in particular. But I would guess that at one of them, that might be at the very top of the heap, is preparing them for release. And there's a law called the Second Chance Act that was passed in 2008. It's actually up for reauthorization this year, and I think about to have a markup, and which provides some federal funding for mentorship and other transition programs. And if somebody's prepared to talk about that statute in particular, it might be a useful use of time. But also, just more generally, talk about what happens when prisoners and women prisoners walk out the door, and the issues that we should be thinking about relating to that.
Well, I think certainly all the women that I did time with, and I imagine all male prisoners, think with great anticipation, but also great anxiety about the day that they will hit the streets and either be freed or be released into halfway house custody, which is very different than being free. My observation as a prisoner in the Bureau of Prisons is that the preparation for release was extremely limited, sort of limited to a really basic classroom setting and sort of a series of lectures or meetings, some of which were truly unfocused, some of which were in topic areas like housing or health, which were exceptionally important in terms of making a successful transition home, and yet we're not focused at all on the reality of most women who are incarcerated's lives. It's important to sort of come back to that point that 80% of criminal defendants are too poor to afford a lawyer. The vast majority of people in prison come from our poorest and most vulnerable communities. And so the systems which may have been sustaining in some way to them before their incarceration, they've been severed from those systems. So that is true if you are talking about, medical care. That's true if you're talking about aid to families. I think one of the most counterintuitive things about the way that prisons and jails function is that they really do work hard to sever the ties that bind to the outside world, often in the name of security. Mm-hmm. So there's a host of ways in terms of limitations on visiting, the incredibly prohibitive cost of phone calls for prison families, the ability to sort of speak to your loved ones on the phone, to be with them in the visiting room with any frequency. In some cases, you have a no-touch visit through glass. These things are devastating for any prisoner, but for women, and especially for mothers of minor children, these factors, which are done in the name of security for these facilities, make successful reentry that much harder and that much more challenging. Back to some of Brenda's points about the unique factors that drive women's incarceration and are sort of governing factors about, in terms of what their incarceration is like, a higher preponderance of mental illness, a higher preponderance of substance abuse than you see in the male population, and an incredibly high incidence of the experience of sexual violence or other physical violence in their personal histories, whether that be their childhood or their more recent personal histories before they're incarcerated. Those things are all waiting for them when they get out, because very rarely are things like substance abuse addressed successfully while you're incarcerated. Prison's not a good place to get people healthy. And substance abuse and mental illness, it's true in both cases. And if there is underlying trauma, like that experience of violence. There's really nothing about being in prison that heals that trauma. And in fact, most of the things that happen in prison and jail are sort of intentionally traumatizing, right? And that's kind of what people expect on some level. Like we sort of have designed prison to be traumatizing. And then we're surprised when people come out kind of basket cases.
I want to sort of open things up, and I'm going to stop calling on people individually so much because we can mix it up, and that would be fun. But I have to say, because it's fascinating to follow up on, Kathy, intentionally traumatizing, or do prison administrators just enjoy being cruel, or are they so understandably worried about security that they prioritize security overall, or what gives?
I say, well, there's no simple answer. A lot gives. Well, for starters, I do think, and this probably doesn't win me friends in my own occupational group, but I do think, as we see with any occupation, people are drawn to certain jobs for a reason. And for those who come into corrections, I think it is incumbent upon any director to have a really good psychological screening at the front door. You don't want to hire staff that have issues around power and control, particularly if it relates to any vulnerable class of citizen. So yes, there are some folks, and I know I've happily terminated my share of those folks from a system that did have malice in mind. I also think that some of the trauma is a result of a lack of understanding and appreciation for the differences between the genders. To Brenda's point, the pathway, particularly around substance abuse, medical conditions, it really comes down to the economies of scale. I mean, most large prison systems have a one-size-fits-all. These are hierarchical bureaucracies, and it's easier to have one process that applies unilaterally across the board. But I think what we are seeing are generations of flawed policy of generalizing what we think works with men and dragging that over and imposing it in our women's prisons. And fortunately, with the help and the support of so many federal agencies, a lot of work is going in to taking a close look at what are the differences in the treatment needs. Because at the end of the day, if we don't address the needs that contribute to crime for men and women, for anyone coming into our systems, we're not going to reduce recidivism. And isn't that, at the end of the day, one of the things sentences is supposed to accomplish? Reducing recidivism, reducing the incidence of crime, changing behavior. I would often say to my staff, people come to prison as punishment. They don't come to prison for punishment. It is not our job to layer additional punishments. And so the honest answer is yes, some of it is intentionally inflicted. You hope you weed that out. Many policies have the unintended consequence of inflicting additional trauma. There's an awful lot of work to be done.
Brenda, please.
So, Ruth, one of the things that I wanted to say is, and Kathy, one of the things that you talked about was the psychological exams, right? That are really a good thing. Well, we also know that, can everybody hear me? Right? So we also know that those tests are actually only good for a year, right? Because after being in the system for a year, whatever you were before you came in as a staff person, you're different, right? And so if that has an impact on people who have power, what impact do you think that has on people who are powerless? And so I think that's something that we have to really think about. Another piece that I wanted to talk about, in particular as it relates to women and the issue of preparation, right, for getting people out in the one-size-fits-all. I mean, prisons are still teaching people the same thing that they taught them when prisons first started in the 1800s. So women are learning to sew, they're learning to clean, there weren't typewriters in the 1800s, but they're learning to type. They're learning to copy. That's what they are learning. And those are not the kinds of jobs that are preparing women to go out and be self-sufficient. I remember meeting a woman who actually was in the Federal Bureau of Prisons, and actually they have a number of, I'd say, more advanced training programs there. And so she got some training in terms of laying cable, right? And I thought, wow, what an awesome job. But the reality was, because of her sentence, because she had been incarcerated, she couldn't get a security clearance to actually go and do that job. Yeah. And so even when there is training, there, first you have a situation where the training or the services that are offered in custody are not ones that can get people good jobs once they're out. And we can talk at some point later about what men are being trained for, which is very different and very remunerative positions.
But let me ask, is there a role for the courts, the Constitution, litigation in addressing some of these disparities?
You know what? There absolutely is. And I have to tell you that some of us have died on that cross. And
I'm sorry to hear that.
Well, one of the interesting things is actually right here in DC, there was a case called Women Prisoners versus DC that I spent a lot of time in. I actually had some great help, not from Aaron Fox, but from another law firm here that shall not be named. We were in that litigation for 10 years. And actually, when it went to the Court of Appeals, not for DC, but for the DC Circuit, there was really a very important decision made that in terms of the challenge, men and women were not similarly situated, right? For equal protection purposes. And for that reason, you could offer different programs and services for men than you could for women. And, there was actually a very good dissent from Judge Rogers, which I think people should read.
Judith Rogers.
Exactly,
Right.
From Judith Rogers, that people should read. Obviously, it's emblazoned on my heart because it was the decision that I wish that the panel had written. But there is a place for the law, and I actually think that the law actually hasn't been very good with regard to providing the same kinds of services for women and for men. You're much more likely to be in a situation where women will get parenting programs, which is great, right? Will get increased visitation. They will get contact visitation, and men won't. But men will have access to electrical training, apprenticeships in prisons and jails, car repair, furniture building, all of those things. And women don't have access to those kinds of services, and often also don't have the access to the same kinds of educational opportunities that men do as well.
Does anybody have anything they want to add, Piper?
I would just say in sort of compare and contrast terms, there's a Midwestern state, which will go unnamed, which I've visited many times now, and I've visited men's facilities and women's facilities there. And when you visit the women's facilities, you find a nursery program, you find a sober living house, you find good programs, though I would point out that they are only available to a tiny fraction of the women who are incarcerated in this particular facility. And when you visit the men's facility, you find a computer lab, and volunteers fly in from Silicon Valley and train the guys on how to code. And one of the guys that I was, talking to there last time I visited said, "Oh, there's a guy who got released. He's making $100,000 a year now coding." And there's a language lab, and there's a wealth of activity going on in that men's prison that connects to the outside economy in very real work. There's a welding program. In the women's prison, the vocational program is a cleaning program. And so women ultimately are transitioned into janitorial positions if they're lucky. And so, this is really grounded in, totally concrete things. This makes a huge difference in people's lives when they get released.
Please.
I also wanted to make another comment, particularly the comment about addiction and trauma, right? And I think Kathy made a great point about trauma. And I want to just talk about one thing, which actually has a link to the Constitution, which is searches, right? For a very, very long time, there were cross-gender searches of women, right? And we're talking about some of the most, for those of you who hate going through TSA and who always get stopped, I would be that person. Really intrusive searches that require you to shake your bra out, that require you to spread your legs while men are running their hands all over your body. And that in and of itself is a very traumatic event that women experience each and every day in many, many institutions, in addition to being watched by men while they shower or while they sleep or while they're unclothed. And there have been some successful challenges to that, but those challenges are by circuit, right? And so often those challenges haven't been made. The Prison Rape Elimination Act tries to do that, but in fact, it doesn't. I think that, is it 2017, right? In, I think, 2017, if people comply with the act, there will not any longer be cross-gender pet searches of women and cross-gender viewing. But obviously, because of federalism, people have the right to either opt in or opt out, right? And so again, when we talk about trauma, there's some very specific things that happen every day, many times a day, in institutional settings for women that increase trauma.
Well, let's you've now messed up my baskets, and no, it's okay. It's caused me to move basket number 3, which are issues related to autonomy, up to be basket number 2. So, and Piper, I think you're in the perfect position to discuss these issues of autonomy that are some of the things that Brenda mentioned, issues of sexual abuse, issues of pregnancy and motherhood while in prison. Just set the stage for this discussion in terms of the variety of issues that women face that are different of necessity because they are women.
So I was held in 3 facilities, a minimum security prison camp in the federal system, in a prison setting, the Federal Transfer Center in Oklahoma City, which is sort of a mixed-use facility, and then a federal jail in Chicago. And so in all of those facilities, men outnumbered women in terms of staffing by far. And I believe that is true pretty overwhelmingly in women's institutions all over this country. I think city jails tend to have more parity in terms of staff, which is generally the best case scenario, though city jails are certainly not the best case scenario. And so that creates an incredibly strange dynamic in terms of gender and power, because there are few greater power disparities than that between a prison staffer or a correctional officer and a prisoner. And so gender on top of that, things can get pretty ugly pretty fast. On an individual level, I would go on record with confidence saying that there are instances of sexual exploitation or abuse in probably every single women's facility in this country. In some facilities, that becomes much more systemic, much more insidious, and dangerous. So, right now, the Tutwiler Prison for Women in Alabama is under investigation by the Department of Justice for having a really horrific situation with sexual abuse and also other kinds of abuse. And that tethers into the use of things like solitary confinement to silence women, to punish women, to frighten women who might report that type of abuse. And Tutwiler is a good example, and many other facilities. There's a lot of detail actually in that testimony that you referred to about the use of solitary confinement as a silencing tool against female prisoners specifically. It's interesting about the pat downs, which is, I mean, sort of the other extreme to being raped in custody, is just that incredibly typical. I mean, I can't tell you. I mean, we had cross-gender pat downs when I was incarcerated constantly. You constantly are being patted down.
Did that offend you?
You know,
Upset you?
I'm fortunate because I don't have a history of sexual violence personally. I certainly didn't love it, and there were certainly certain correctional officers who took that pat down far beyond into, you know, what's clearly groping and deeply inappropriate sexual, you know, abuse.
And you just had to stand there and take it.
Well, actually, the example I'm thinking of didn't make me laugh exactly. There was a woman named Beatrice Codiani who was incarcerated with me. She's since been released. She's a very powerful, you know, a strong voice for change in Connecticut, which is where she lives now. And she took it to court and she challenged those cross-gender pat-downs and was successful. But what that meant is that basically they just stopped patting down Beatrice Codiani. It's almost like she had a get-out-of-jail card. So she was like, oh yeah, you can't pat me down, but they kept patting down everybody else. It's not like the institution changed because of that legal challenge. So it's a really formidable situation, much like some of the debates around women in the military who seek justice. It is incredibly difficult for a female prisoner, or any prisoner really, to get justice from the system which is supervising them. And so the lack of any outside valve for prisoners to seek justice is a significant problem if we want to have truly humane, safe, legal prisons and jails.
I'd like to follow up on what you were just saying about these cross-gender pat-downs and what you had said earlier about efforts being made to kind of sever the connections of prisoners with their families and the outside world. And as you were talking now, I was reminded what you said in your book, which is that this kind of pat down and having to squat down and all the rest always happened after you had had a visit from someone. And before. So the connection between having a visit, which is, of course, a relationship with the outside world, and having to go through this as a price for doing that is definitely driven home. Now, what, from your perspective, and I ask this as someone who, with some of my colleagues here, Judges Kessler and Murray, have visited prisons. Judge Murray goes every 2 weeks to a book group at FCW in Maryland. And partly we do it because we think this is a way of bringing outside eyes and ears into the prison, knowing what is going on, letting the women there know that there is somebody outside who is taking a look, is paying attention, and hopefully getting through to the people who run the prisons. We try to do that at the prison level by actually, as I said, showing up, but then also at a more systemic level, both with primarily with the Bureau of Prisons and the Department of Justice. I think you mentioned at one point that there was a program of women who came in from outside, like I think it was maybe a Dress for Success kind of program. What was the impact of this? Did it matter? Did it make a difference?
The incident, what you're describing is the one-day job fair that happened in this particular prison, and job fairs are, one-day job fairs, I think, are fairly commonly held within the BOP. I don't know about state systems. But the macro truth about volunteers, whether they be judges, which is fantastic, or everyday volunteers, or anyone really from the outside, is that their presence in the facility and their commitment to prisoners and to prisoners' either success coming home or simply to their quality of life while they're incarcerated is incredibly powerful as a signal to prisoners, because you really feel forgotten, and for many women who have fewer resources to stay connected to the outside world for a variety of reasons, that relationship with a volunteer can be incredibly, incredibly powerful and important. What kind of impact it has on the institution is an interesting one, because you point out a very good point about sort of the disincentive to have visits because of the invasiveness of a strip search. And I definitely knew women who didn't have visits because they didn't want to go through strip searches. And so this is actually a great example, not in the classic sort of the bad egg correctional officer who terrorizes people and is vindictive, but more that question of systemic design that creates unintended but really bad consequences. That's a great example of how prison is sort of traumatizing in a way that we don't necessarily think about it when we design these places. Does that make sense?
Actually, I'd like to add to Piper's comments, because the introduction of the topic of volunteers, I'd like to sort of link that back to a question that you had posed, Ruth, about reentry. You know, so many systems are dependent upon volunteers coming into the system for a variety of different reasons, whether it's to assist and support addressing spiritual needs, religious needs, occupational needs, mentoring, providing supportive housing on the outside. I mean, I cannot tell you the quality of the volunteers that come in and out, particularly at the state level. I'm not familiar with the federal level, but at the state level. This is so critically important for a couple of reasons. When you step into the state systems, unlike the federal system, I know the facility that I had in total about 600 women. Only 12 of them were doing life. I had women who were incarcerated as civil commitments strictly because they were addicted. No criminal history. They were deterred by the system into a prison, into a correctional setting, because their families had concern about their level of addiction. They were deemed to be threats to themselves, and prison was considered the best place as opposed to bona fide substance abuse treatment. And I also had half of the population doing very short time. When women come into a system serving 30 to 60 days, quite frankly, many of these women, the immediate need is detox and medical stabilization. It's Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It's addressing the need to keep them healthy. So the medical piece kicks in. Many of these women who come in the front door have mental illness, and they've never appropriately been diagnosed, much less been given a treatment plan that included medicine. So by the time we start to walk through all these really pressing needs, at some point one needs to be thinking about reentry. And I'm always put off when people talk about reentry as if it's a discrete class or a program. Mm-hmm. It really is a process. It's a philosophy, and it should start the minute someone is arrested. How do we get them back into the community functioning fully and wholly and reconnected to their family, employed and paying taxes? That's my utopia.
And this is not your utopia, which is the question of sexual abuse in prisons. I'm guessing that you had some experience, not personal experience, obviously, but that there were some incidents that arose because bad things happen in good prisons.
When I was the superintendent at Framingham, my first year, I removed more than a handful of officers for sexual inappropriate sexual relationships. Some were romantic, a little bit different than sexual, because we had a Massachusetts general law that we had to be mindful of that defined what this activity was. But it was common. And I have to tell you, I did have personal experience with it. When I worked at Walpole State Prison as a 20-year-old intern from a women's college in Massachusetts with much the same background of Piper, I was there for 2 days, and a group of male lifers approached me and warned me about a particular staff member who had a clinical background, warned me, don't be in a room alone with him. And I made the mistake of being in a room alone with him, and he pinned me up against the wall and tweaked my nipples. And when I complained about it, I was told, well, you know, he's just a really outgoing, friendly Italian guy. Well, I decided I was not going to date any Italians from there on in. My point is, here I was as a staff member, and it was being discounted. And that at a very early age, I became aware that it's not all that it appears to be behind the wall. You know, we have this stereotype of who's the good guys and the bad guys. And I learned very early on that you need to meet people where they are at and treat them with respect and dignity. Because at the end of the day, that's what all human beings are entitled to. But the impact on women who have been sexually abused is, I just cannot begin to comprehend the level of trauma. Mine was so incidental and on a personal level didn't have impact on me. But when you look at the histories that women come into the system with, and it's often a volunteer that they can confide in. It's often they're linked to the outside, but they're not allowed in most systems to have any continued contact with that volunteer post-release.
So, Judge Ruiz, did you have something you wanted to add?
Well, as we were talking about pathways and kind of subgroups within the prisons, I wanted to make sure that we mentioned, although I don't know the numbers, I was hoping somebody here might know, about the number of women who are being held in prison on basically immigration, for immigration purposes, having nothing to do with the commission of any violent crime. Many people don't consider it a crime in any event.
Right.
Or just on detainers from ICE, from the immigration enforcement part of the Department of Homeland Security. I remember when we visited the prison in Hazleton, about 30% of the women there. That was the reason why they were in prison. Many actually were from Mexico, did not speak, or other parts of Central America, did not speak English or very little English. I remember a woman coming up to me to ask me whether in Spanish, I mean, she saw somebody I can talk to about the fact that she had a health problem, that she had been asking for an appointment with a doctor, and could I help her get that done? I think I was eventually able to help her get an appointment. I don't really know. I mean, I brought it up with the proper person. But I happened to be there that day and she could talk to me. But otherwise,
Right.
Did you have much experience with this, Kathy, with groups of people who, you know, I mean, I remember I liked in your book, a Spanish mammy. I like I'll be called that from now on.
Not so much, I mean, in terms of immigration detainers, not so much in the state system. After I left the state system, I actually went into a county system
Right.
for about a year and a half. I think you tend to see more ICE detainees held at the county level, at the local level, which if you think there is a wide range of practice between states, it's an even wider, unwieldy, unobserved level of practice at the local level. But we did have a standalone immigration facility, and which was rather unique in the New England area. And the language barriers alone were significant. And really, I mean, if we, to Piper's earlier point, if we think the system fosters a disconnect in relationships, whether it's volunteers or families or community or children specifically, it's double the impact. Because many, at least in the system that I was in, many of the folks who were housed there were actually coming from another part of the country.
Yes.
Because you're cited to the earliest, to the location from which you will be deported.
Right.
So these people are moved around, and puts them in a decided disadvantage.
I would make a point. Immigration is not one of my areas of expertise, but what I do know is that sheriffs and other operators of county level or city level facilities are receiving a great deal of federal dollars to do those immigration detainers. And the other player that is really benefiting from immigration detention is private prison companies, because they hold vast contracts to do those immigration detentions. So there's skin in the game.
I actually have one really quick question about that, which you may be able to answer, Brenda. Are the private prison companies, what is their constitutional legal role and liability? In 30 seconds or less. Go.
You know, it's interesting because there are all kinds of issues about their degree of liability, whether they're acting under color of state law. Lots of litigation going on there. And in fact, there's some going on in a case actually out in, I believe it's Texas, called Hutto, which interestingly enough involves sexual abuse of women who were in a family facility that they had actually had to close because they found a correctional officer coming out of the room, zipping his pants up in a room where there was a woman and a child.
How could they not possibly be acting under color of state law?
Well, the thing is it depends on how you contract, right? There are ways that you can contract to get out of that acting under color of state law. So, for example, the Department of Homeland Security uses a lot of intergovernmental service agreements. And it's just as corporations do, they move around their liability, right? And so I think that it's an issue that really bears looking at. And there is a reason for the proliferation of private prisons, because what people are really trying to do, not only the private prisons, but also the government is trying to limit liability.
So we have a few more things that we need to talk about before we move to questions. And they are issues of, if you think about autonomy and you think about health, probably the most vivid image is the question of the pregnant, shackled prisoner giving birth. And I don't know who wants to address that subject, but I think we need to talk about pregnancy. We need to talk about access to health services, and we need to talk about solitary confinement, which is, as you've described, really has particular issues of relevance and horror for women. So who wants to tackle shackled pregnant women? Brenda.
Unconstitutional. Eighth Amendment. Clearly.
And we're done with that?
Well, I wish that we would be done with
It's
that.
still happening.
Oh, absolutely, it's still
Okay.
happening. People,
But it's unconstitutional, she
Yes,
gasped.
Exactly. But the
How
fact,
do we know it's unconstitutional?
because there have been decisions that have found it to be unconstitutional. One of the great things about Women Prisoners versus DC, which included a claim
Okay.
not only about shackling of pregnant women during labor and delivery, but of a woman who actually gave birth while she was chained, and also a woman who gave birth in the institution whose baby was delivered by another inmate, right? So unconstitutional. But the problem is that these challenges are state by state. And when we talk about the impact on women, in the same way that we talk about people not going to visits because of the searches, often women who are at the highest risk for problems with their pregnancies and their deliveries would not go over to the hospital because they were going to be transported in the shackles where their feet and their arms were together, or their hands were together. So it continues to be a problem.
And that's true in states that have legislatively banned the practice, like New York, where I live. We passed legislation, and it was signed into law by Governor Patterson at the time, banning the shackling of women, and it definitely is continuing to happen in state prisons in New York.
So Kathy, I have two questions for you. The first is why, since you speak for all current and former prison administrators anywhere. And the second is, so you're a prison administrator and you're working with a budget, and your budget does not cover anywhere near the kind of health services that you want to be able to provide to prisoners. And I would guess, as they are in the free private sector, that women prisoners are a heck of a lot more expensive to keep healthy than men prisoners for all the obvious reasons. So, well, first of all, why are you shackling them? And number two, why aren't you giving them adequate health care?
Number one, I don't shackle them. But, your question goes so deep into culture. I didn't want to interrupt earlier, but I'm glad you posed this question because, you can have court decisions, and you're right, Brenda, they come down state by state. When I was commissioner in Massachusetts, I changed policy. One of the things I did was, after my experience at Framingham, I said, you know what? I want a person on the staff who is solely looking at everything that goes on in the system, policies, procedures, recommendations to the legislature, budget, through the eyes of female offenders. And I want that person working for me, and I want every single policy that is established in this department to be reviewed by that person. It needs to pass muster in terms of its impact on women so that we stop ignoring the unique circumstances. So one of the things we did, we wrote into policy, you may not shackle. Department policy. Never had to discipline anyone after it went in writing. The problem is that that policy also applied to 14 county sheriffs who decided to pick and choose whether they would abide by it. As a result, using Massachusetts as a case study, our legislature just weeks ago passed an anti-shackling law. I think it raises some fundamental issues around the challenges of implementing change in corrections in a resistant to change culture. And two, the lack of oversight, accountability, and transparency that exists in our nation's prisons. More so than any other element of the criminal justice system. Judges are held accountable on appeal. You can go into a courtroom and see the actions. Many of us can see what goes on with police officers. We may not understand the full role, but we see them on a street corner. For the most part, the doors to our prisons are closed, which is the irony. We want them to swing one way for reentry, but we don't allow them to swing open to maintain relationships and volunteers, etc. But it goes to culture. It goes directly to culture, and that is as unique as each and every state and each and every court decision.
Great. We're going to go to Q&A, but I'm going to demand that one of the cues be on the subject of solitary confinement, because otherwise I'm going to get an incomplete from my panel, and I really want Piper to like me because I really like her. So if you want Piper to like you, ask your question about solitary confinement, because otherwise I'm going to seize back the microphone. Do we have any questions? And do we have microphones for the questioners, or just talk loud? Oh, there is a microphone.
Hi, hello. I'm Aaron Johnson. I'm a DC-based attorney and criminal justice advocate, and having lived here for about 10 years, I've become aware of the practice of DC-based prisoners being taken into the Federal Bureau of Prisons, unlike any state system. And so I just wanted to know if anyone had anything to say about the particular impact of women, DC women that are being subjected to that practice, and what we can do about that as DC-based practitioners, lawyers, et cetera. And thank you for being here.
Thank you. We have been in that fight for such a long time. And there have been these times when DC has had all of its women. Then there have been times when they've sent them to federal institutions. And now we're sort of in this weird situation where we have one facility, the correctional treatment facility, which holds women, I believe, who are serving sentences of less than a year, right? And that is what we are, that's really what we're working with. One of the other things that we didn't talk about, which I'm going to use your question to sort of raise, is the fact that there are just not that many facilities for women. whether it's in DC or whether it's in Virginia or whether it's in the Federal Bureau of Prisons, there are just not that many women. In fact, the facility that Piper was in at Danbury, I mean, there was a massive fight because they planned to close it down, make it a men's facility, and send all of those women who were there to Aliceville, Alabama, right? Aliceville, Alabama. And they have started sending women and dispersing those women. And so it's a problem that is particularly acute for DC women who can be sent to Texas, to California, to Florida, I mean, everywhere. But it's also just a problem with women in general in any system, and in particular for women who are in the federal system. It sucks.
Is that a technical legal term?
Yes, it is.
Back there. Thank you. Yep, you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Constitution Project. My name is Kikichi Taifa. I'm with the Society Foundation for the Justice Roundtable. Kathy, when you began speaking, you spoke about the tremendous sea change with respect to practices in women's facilities over the past 20 years. And I must say that Brenda Smith has been the catalyst that really has been largely responsible for those changes. And this was long before Piper came along. So I just really want to
So there.
that you have done in this capacity. And
Piper is the new Brenda.
Oh, okay. Did I need this? Okay. I don't know. Okay. How are you? You spoke about traumatizing a number of times during your comments, and it is indeed traumatizing. And maybe this is an area where you can speak to solitary confinement. I did, in fact, see you, of course, testify before the Senate Judiciary Committee on that very topic. But I want you to speak of it also in the context of some criticism that has come about as a result of Orange is the New Black being categorized, what's it, Academy Awards? I don't watch public, but in terms of in the comedy, humorous category. So how do you counteract the seriousness and the trauma and issues such as solitary and the like versus, getting up the ratings and all like that in terms of being comedy and humorous? I know one of your colleagues, Sandra James, and Justice as Healing, had a whole campaign against it being categorized like that because of the very real experiences of the women. Thank you.
Yeah, that awards category stuff is kind of weird because you have to, not to get in the weeds on the Hollywood stuff, they have to nominate it as a comedy or as a drama. So a lot of people see it as a drama and some people see it as a comedy. And I think the thing that is provocative about the show is that it uses humor to examine really serious themes like violence and racism and, a host of serious themes. I got to tell you, I think quite bluntly, without the humor, it would be very difficult for many audiences to come to those themes or to come to the content. And that, I think, has been true in popular culture going back a long time, that we have used humor at times to discuss the topics which are most difficult for us. In terms of its categorization, in the Emmys, I'm not quite sure how they came to that decision in terms of which category to enter it, but that was a decision that Netflix made. So I fully understand that prison is this traumatizing experience for everyone. And I do think that all prisoners or most prisoners draw on humor as part of their survival strategy while you're actually incarcerated. But I completely understand when folks say, hey, there's nothing funny about prison. That is a perfectly legitimate point of view.
And speaking of nothing funny, solitary confinement.
Solitary confinement is not funny. There are estimated to be 80,000 people held in solitary confinement in this country right now, which is a staggering percentage of the overall prison and jail population. After 10 days in solitary confinement, a healthy person will begin to deteriorate rapidly, mentally, emotionally, psychologically. I would observe that disproportionately solitary confinement is used as punishment for people who struggle with mental illness. It is harder for people with mental illness to follow the rules of a facility. That's the simple truth. And that can really create these terrible spirals of sanctions, which land them in solitary confinement. For a mentally ill person to be held in isolation is a disaster, and simply should not be allowed. There is federal legislation that's been proposed by Senators Booker and Paul, which would include a significant limitation on the use of solitary confinement for children in the system. It's a little shocking to think about how many youth are currently in solitary confinement and the effect that isolation has on a child. I hope that that legislation is successful.
Ruth, I'd like to say a little something also about solitary confinement, because often the same conditions where people are, where they're doing solitary confinement, they use for a variety of purposes, right? And so, for example, you can have administrative segregation, which is people who broke some prison rule. But you can also have protective custody. So people who fear for their safety, who've been sexually victimized while they're in custody, young people who are in adult facility, who the facility doesn't think it can keep safe in any other way except for keeping them in solitary. Or you can also have people who are in solitary who are gender nonconforming. So you have lots of LGBTI folks who are in solitary because, frankly, the institution doesn't believe that it can keep them safe. And so it can be a terrible space for people to be in, not only because of the isolation, but also because there's very limited movement. Oftentimes they don't get visits. Sometimes they don't get, depending on what their situation is, they may not have books. They may not even have access to programming as well, which in another way also, because these systems are so inflexible, you could go into isolation or protective custody, right? And also get more time, right? So because you're not able to earn good time while you're there, you're not able to program. So it's a very terrible situation and system.
Kathy, is there a role for solitary confinement?
Very, very limited, very limited. I think, and quite frankly, most of those instances I would gather are on the male side of the house. In the aftermath of a serious prison riot, in the aftermath of multiple homicides, one of the first things from a security perspective is to separate people, to separate them immediately in terms of safety until one can figure out who it is who's responsible. You go into a cell block at a maximum security prison, and if you've got 20 people who are there for having killed someone and there's a homicide, you're really not quite sure who the likely culprit may be. So the first caveat always has to be the safety and security of those who live in that unit as well as staff. I really question the purpose of long-term solitary confinement absent a punishment. And I think sometimes, for any parent who's ever sent their kid to their room, there is some value in sort of stop, pause, go to your room. Solitary confinement that strips individuals of access to newspapers and books and the basics, I don't see the value in that. But I do understand from a security standpoint, upon occasion, there is a need to totally separate.
Kathy, are there safeguards in terms of somebody is sent into isolation, let's say not as part of protective custody, that after a certain number of days, the situation has to be reviewed
Yes. I mean, there are in systems that pay attention to those issues. I mean, there are some basic givens. One, a screening before placement in solitary. And this again goes to the culture issue that I had raised earlier, that you can have a policy. You can have a policy that clearly states that before someone is placed in segregation, solitary confinement, that they go through a screening, that a clinician determines whether it is appropriate or harmful. Most prison systems have something in writing that clearly states and gives the clinician the right to say, no, there's a contraindication to placement. You very seldom see that invoked because the cultural pressures within that organization position people to not be the one to appear to be soft on crime or whatever, however we want to frame it. So it's it's yet another example of we can't claim success just when a law is passed or a policy is written. The critical piece is the fidelity in the implementation of that law and policy. Is it really happening as intended? But presuming that person is placed in segregation, there has to be high-level review. We're not talking a perfunctory cell check. I mean, I've been in prison systems where someone will say, well, we had contact with everybody in solitary. A staff member went around the room, knocked on the door and said, hey, do you want to see a doctor today? That's not really communication. That's not a check-in. But many systems are paying attention to this. And there are some real bright spots out there in terms of addressing this issue.
Great. More questions? I'm looking around for a guy right there. Usually I have to beg women in the audience. But this one is reversed. So thank you.
Well, my question is basically going back to the solitary. What's the alternative? Because obviously, there are a lot of issues with people being sent to solitary for very, very bad things. Crimes or rule violations. But what exactly is the alternative punishment or to this kind of segregation?
I mean, thinking about it from the frame of what is the alternative punishment is one question, and you can of course expand that question to consider prisons and jails entirely, not just solitary confinement cells. I'll tell you an example of looking at it from a different direction. So there's a men's prison that I visited that has reduced its shoe numbers dramatically. I can't remember the exact numbers off the top of my head if I had them in front of me, but I think they used to have like 175 shoe beds, solitary confinement beds. And they've reduced those numbers to such a large extent that they were able to convert, permanently, some of that housing into sort of gold star housing for lifers who are really doing all the things that they're supposed to do. And I asked the warden of that prison, what did you do? Did you embark on a campaign? Did you put a whole bunch of did you put some sort of policy in place to drive your shoe numbers down? And he said, no. What happened is that we started doing other things in the prison. We started giving guys more opportunities for meaningful activity. We started giving guys more opportunities for work, work opportunities, things like welding. And we started giving them really simple incentives, like if you stay sanction-free for 3 months, you'll get some free deodorant. That's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about incentives. And lo and behold, we saw the shoe numbers come down, dramatically. So it's a question, again, of sort of culture and community, because like it or not, these are, what happens behind the walls of a prison or jail is a kind of a community. It is a community in its own way. And so I think often of that example of how that institution's shoe numbers dropped so dramatically through nothing other than trying to treat those guys more humanely. And that, to me, says a lot.
Back in the red shirt back there on the aisle so you can get a microphone easily.
That's an orange shirt.
Orange shirt.
Who did that, Piper?
I have gotten that wrong.
Yeah. Just for Piper. So I have two quick questions. One is for Brenda. Can you talk a little bit about PREA as it relates to women's institutions and women prisoners on women prisoners rape? Because I don't think that that's something that comes up a lot in terms of PREA. And then Piper, if you could talk a little bit about, you didn't have your child when you were inside, you were shackled, you were out, but some of the women that you were inside with, could you talk a little bit about that child, children being able to visit their parents and what the women went through? That's one of the areas that we're looking at now, is the children of incarcerated parents and the impact that it has on them. So you could talk a little bit about that. Thank you. I'm sorry, I'm Angeline Fraser with NACDL.
Great. So people have been throwing around the name PREA, and that's the Prison Rape Elimination Act that was passed in 2003. Going specifically to Angeline's question about female-on-female sexual victimization, right? I think one of the things that was very interesting, that has been very interesting in all of the data collected, and if anybody's interested in this issue, you can look at all of the data, is the discomfort with anything that's not vanilla, right? Anything that's not male on female rape. And so I think that there have been issues in looking at female staff who actually, it turns out, are the most likely perpetrators of staff sexual misconduct in all facilities, adult and juvenile, right? And so a lot of discomfort with that, and very little about female on female sexual victimization. If you're interested, though, in someone who has actually looked at it really carefully and does a great job, there is a huge amount of information from Barbara Owen, who did a big report looking specifically at female on female victimization. Obviously, they were looking at inmate on inmate and did not talk a lot about female staff and female inmates. One of the things that I would also say, we don't have a whole lot of time, is that all of those relationships with regard to sexuality are totally flipped in institutional settings in some ways that I think that people don't want to look at. I have a great article, infomercial, called Rethinking Prison Sex, and I'm happy to send it to anybody who's interested.
Kathy, does that phenomenon that women correctional officers are the most likely perpetrators, does that surprise you or not?
I would clarify that. I wouldn't necessarily say officers, nurses, teachers, very often folks who work in the helping professions, because, to
helping professions.
Well, yes. To Piper's point, it is a community, and in a perverse kind of way, prisons really are a village. I mean, you've got maintenance men, you've got food service providers, you've got, a little store, a little canteen, you've got telephone people. I mean, you've got all these different groups. We tend to think, oh, it's correction officers, because that's the uniform that we attach. In my experience, I have sadly challenged chaplains, nurses, doctors, a couple of doctors, more than a couple of doctors. The list goes on and on and on. But I do think there is a level of surprise, to Brenda's point, particularly when you look at maximum security, the data for maximum security and the role that women staff are playing in inappropriate sexual relationships with male offenders. The problem, aside from the obvious of prison rape, these situations are almost always wrapped up in other activities, introduction of contraband, drugs. Several high-profile incidents. Baltimore. Staff members impregnated by the same inmate, walking around with the tattoo of the name of the inmate on their arms. We had a couple of high-profile escapes across the country. So these are really serious from a moral perspective, a physical safety perspective, and a security perspective.
We have, in addition to the distinguished judge on our panel, some distinguished judges in our audience, and I don't want to call on a judge without being recognized. But if I might approach your honors, do you have any questions that you'd like, or comments that you'd like to share with us as a way to wrap up? That's my line. It has been a wonderful panel, but
I would just say that a lot of us have tried to get attention to this
Right.
issue. So what I would ask Ruth Marcus, why hasn't the press picked it up more? I mean, do we have to do a Ferguson,
She
Missouri?
totally flipped it on you.
All right. This is terrible, and we've been working for years with the Bureau of Prisons to get them to consider gender, and
Yep.
zilch, nothing. I mean, negative almost. Well, Gladys is too polite to say that.
can I'm going to plead no contest or guilty. I don't know. It depends on whether I can get a private attorney to represent me. I think it's a totally legitimate question. And I think it really goes, and I think you could even broaden it beyond that, though there have been some notable exceptions. I think that issues of the treatment of prisoners have gone extraordinarily undercovered in the news media. And that's a reflection of two things that one is immutable, which is these are the least powerful, most voiceless people in society. Those are the people who we're supposed to be paying attention to, because we have, I don't know if we have power anymore, but we still do have a voice. And you're totally right. I will, just for the sentencing phase, say that I did write, a actually fascinating column. I thought it was fascinating anyway. I think about, solitary confinement among adolescents.
Oh.
And that was I usually don't write a column based only on a report, but the facts in this report, I believe it was from the ACLU, were so horrifying that I just typed out their examples and stuck my name on the top of it with due credit. So I hope that mitigates somewhat.
But Ruth, I think it would be helpful to report not only on the things that are bad in prisons, but the things that work. I mean, what Piper mentioned about, getting the rate of people in solitary down by doing these rather simple things that just address the humanity of people who are in prison and recognize that. And I'm now going to make a plug, now since you recognize Judges Kessler and Murray, for some of the programs that the National Association of Women Judges have initiated in prison and continue. And this goes to part of the question you asked about women and their children in particular, because so many women in prison are mothers, and maintaining that connection is so important for the women and for their rehabilitation, and of course for their kids outside for years. We have tried with the Bureau of Prison, the Federal Bureau of Prison, to start a project, which was going to be a pilot project, to have a nursery at a women's facility, so that hopefully after giving birth, hopefully not shackled, they could remain close to their infants for a while. And there are models for this, because there's a prison in New York that has been doing it for years and has done it successfully. There is what we call the Storybook Project, where children's books are sent to women prisoners who can then read those books. They record them in their voice, and then the book and the recording is sent to the child. So they can hear their mother's voice reading them a bedtime story. There are Girl Scouts troops in prisons. The mothers and their girls, can be together for these. So there are things that are not, these are not constitutional issues. They're practical, humane ways of addressing the isolation problem, of just making the incarceration productive as opposed to adding damage to people and relationships that are already damaged. Just improving the communication that people can have. The use of phones. I remember phone rates for prisoners were much higher than for regular people. The prisons were taking a cut. I mean, email communications, mothers with kids. I mean, these are things that can really make a huge difference in the lives of the prisoners and their families. And it shouldn't be that difficult to get them done if somebody were paying attention.
I'm going to give Brenda what I think has to be the last
Very
word here.
small.
Got it.
Two things that could help really immensely in terms of bringing some needed attention to this issue is a hearing on women in custody.
Yeah.
The last one that was held was, I believe, in 1993, right? And there has not been one that has been held since then. And I think that this is a serious enough issue that it needs to have federal attention. And the second is that it has been at least 10 years, maybe even 15, since the Bureau of Justice Statistics has done a report on women in prison.
1999.
Thank you. Was that 15 years?
1999.
Okay, since 1999. It's time, it's overdue. The population has changed, and I think that we know more. So I think that's something that's really important for anybody who happens to be watching this.
Well, thank you to everybody. It's been an amazing honor and incredibly informative for me, and I trust for everybody here and everybody who's clicking on it. So I just want to thank all of you.
Thank you, Ruth.
Thank you, Ruth.
And thank you on behalf of the Constitution Project. This has really been an incredible panel. If I could ask all of you to just hold tight for 2 minutes. We'd like to have a member of the Constitution Project's board, Jane Sherburne, come up and just say a couple things. Thank you.
Thank you all for attending, and thank you to this wonderful panel. This was a perfect kind of project for Constitution Day and for the Constitution Project to sponsor. And nothing happens for free. As my father said to me once in a different context, you can feed a cow on love, but it'll die on you every time. And so you all have a envelope by your chairs. If you can help us continue to be able to do this kind of work. We all like to be problem solvers, but we know that the most effective problem solving strategies occur when we can find areas of consensus among us across a broad spectrum of the population. I think this panel has shown how that can happen, and the other work of the Constitution Project does as well. So we need your help and your support. And if you really appreciated the program today, please take a minute and stick something in that envelope. Piper, I gather you're going to be signing books outside for a little while. So if you didn't get a chance to get a signature on your way in, you can do that. And thank you again very much for coming.